Private Gray for last year if it wasn't for these flags. As some of you may remember, we had to cancel the march last year due to the snow. Thank God it didn't snow this year. Because if we hadn't canceled that march, somebody would have planted these flags, we would have come out here, and they would have been long gone. Instead, we got here, and sure enough, we found Pat, a 7 times descendant of the Civil War, including members of this very unit. So here to give his talk, Walking Amongst Giants, or did you change the name of it? Okay. Private Gray.
Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate to see you. I'm blessed today to be asked by our president to address this gathering of the 142nd Pennsylvania Company F reenactors, our brothers in Company G and the 54th PA Company A, friends and family, and some members of my SUV camp. It is with great humility and a heavy heart that I agreed to do this today. I've entitled today's keynote address to Walk Amongst Giants. This is not just in honor of the giants among the real men of the 142nd, but the missing giant in our ranks today, our much-loved Captain Emeritus, the great Keith McGregor. It's with sincerest hope of all the members of the company, myself included, that Keith would be the one to address us today. I'll do my best in his stead. Let's all keep Keith in our prayers and thoughts today as we do our best to honor the men who gave their last full measure of devotion that balmy July 1st of 1863. Without Keith and all he's contributed to this crazy group of misfits over the years, none of us would be here today. Thank you, Keith. Get well, my friend. We begin our story today in the heart of Somerset County, in the tiny town of Garrett, Pennsylvania. Garrett was not unlike most of the small hamlets, farm towns, and coal towns that have sprung up all over the countrysides of southwestern Pennsylvania. Most of the inhabitants were poor farmers, and 19-year-old Jacob Christner was no different. He carried most of the aspirations of all the young men of the time of small towns. He was described by those who knew him as a stout, strong young man of stolid stature and constitution. I'm sure that the idea of adventure and boredom were just as important as patriotism in his decision to take the 7-mile train ride, probably without a ticket to Berlin, to enlist in the newly formed company put together by Reverend/Captain F.A. Edmonds that would become Company F of the 142nd PVI in August of 1862. Compared to the harsh life working long hours in the field, camp life and drill must have seemed initially to be more challenging mentally than physically. However, that would all change when he had found himself among thousands of young men in cramped quarters training for service in the Federal Army with outbreaks of measles and other childhood illnesses for which he had no immunity. I'm sure he was proud as a peacock to receive his first frock coat until he realized that he would be wearing it for months without a change. I'm sure he was equally thrilled to be issued his first rifle until he realized that it was a recycled smoothbore Belgian conversion musket from the State Armory that wasn't fit to hold a door up, much less defend his life. But the reality would be even more evident when they were prematurely forced out of camp to Fort Massachusetts outside of Washington. There would be little time to train as they were called abruptly into action in Lee's first northern invasion. His first real duty was anything but glorious, and certainly had to be a shock to a young man that had in all likelihood never been more than 20 miles from his home as he found himself in the bloody fields of Sharpsburg. Not to be engaged in glorious battle, which had already been fought, but to dig the graves and help care for the thousands of his comrades wounded in the great conflict of that fateful September 17th. I'm sure like any of us, he was nauseated at the smell of dead corpses and horses and was wondering just what exactly he had gotten himself into. All this time, meanwhile, he had to be wondering when he would see the elephant, himself. It would not take long until he found himself crossing the Rappahannock near the previously quiet town of Fredericksburg in the early hours of December 11, 1862. Imagine the chill, the frigid wind of morning fog rising across the river, not unlike the chill we feel this morning, under a hail of Confederate artillery, and the uncertainty of knowing what would become of him in a desperate uphill charge against an entrenched enemy at Prospect Hill. When he and his comrades would for the first time be engaged that fateful December 13th, they would also learn the harsh reality of the politics of high command. I'm sure as they waded through what was thought to be an impassable swamp and freezing cold with the legendary Pennsylvania Reserves and their sister regiment, the 121st, at their side, crashing through a gap in the Confederate line, that they would end the war that very day. Instead, they would be left to hang on that ridge unsupported because of miscommunications of high command as General Meade was unable to rally the other division commanders to support the breach. Picture the pure terror of the Confederate counterattack, outnumbered 10-1, with the line frozen and no one to support them. It must have been more than young man could bear as the survivors fled for their lives back to the safety of their own lines. There were 270 casualties in the unit that day, but young Jacob was not amongst them. He miraculously found himself amongst the living. The first winter encampment and Christmas away from home near Bill Plain Landing would prove just as harsh and deadly. During the Valley Forge of the Army of the Potomac, young Jacob developed yellow jaundice, which he would carry with him the rest of the war and the rest of his life. His health would fail and he would become a frequent visitor to the infirmary like so many of the other young men in the Army. Spring would find him and the other men of the company and regiment called into battle at Chancellorsville, where they were only lightly engaged in a feint below Fredericksburg, but arrived after midnight after an 18-mile forced march, with the cries of the wounded and the horrific aftermath of the collapse of the 11th Corps. The men of the 142nd got into line, fixed bayonets, and prepared for a midnight charge that fortunately for them never came. After the utter humiliation of Chancellorsville, the Army went into camp around Fredericksburg, and here Jacob found himself trading coffee and tobacco across the Rappahannock with the rebels. I have to think it was difficult to humanize the men on the other side of the river, that he more than likely shared more in common and similarities than most of the gentlemen from other states. It was not long after the orders were given for a forced march north to Washington and through Maryland, with a date of destiny on this very ridge. When Jacob and the 320 men of the 142nd arrived on the ground we now stand, they had been forced marched for 8 miles in seasonably hot weather. They would see the body of their Corps commander, John Reynolds, taken from the field to their front and to the right shortly after their arrival, in the custody of, at one point, according to legend, their very own beloved Colonel Robert P. Cummings. From what I gather from scanned information but can't confirm, Company F was near the center of the line of battle. As young Jacob arrived on the field from the route we just traversed, he had to be terrified, knowing full well what they were facing and exactly what the idea of defending the ridge at all cost meant. And through the smoke of artillery of Battery B to his left, he saw the flags of the 11th, 26th, 47th, and 52nd North Carolina in a formation that extended at least 500 yards beyond that farthest monument on the left and their flank. And they outnumbered the entire brigade, 4-1. He felt the terror of men falling all around him. He felt the unnerving horror of unseen artillery from Hare Ridge, raining hell in the ranks all around him. One can only imagine the struggle to hold the line with volley after volley being poured into the ranks, firing back as quickly as they could return it. Then picture the sudden realization that the rest of the brigade was wheeling back behind you, outflanked and literally bending back over itself. And the only thing protecting your regiment had formerly been Battery B, which was now being moved to the rear. Then among the dim of battle, they came out the call to charge as the valiant colonel led his men on a suicide mission against at least 3-1 odds in this very spot. I couldn't fathom what was going through Jacob's head as he reflexively got into line and did his duty. Then came the collapse of the charge. Entire companies wiped out, the loss of the colors and the mortal wounding of the man they held as Somerset County's greatest soldier. And then the struggle to get his body off the field that cost at least 4 men their lives. And in the end, they were only able to recover their sword. And yet somehow Jacob survived to retreat to the breastworks that were set up in what's now the front parking lot of the seminary. The colors were thankfully saved by an unknown soldier from another regiment, presenting to the 151st Payet's colonel, who was at once placed among the defenders at the seminary. J. Robinson Balsey of Company H would later write in his diary that day he was shot 4 times trying to recover the colors to bring them back in the retreat. As Colonel Horatio Warren described it, our men at this point used their muskets until by fast firing they became so hot they were compelled to drop them, whereas they would take the nearest them to the ground because the owner of it was dead. And I'll add that there were no scarcity of our muskets, as the dead and wounded were largely in the majority of our regiment. Yet young Jacob was not amongst the unfortunates that day. In as orderly a fashion as possible, they finally retreated through the town after being nearly surrounded by the Confederate South Carolina Brigade at the seminary. At the beginning of that day, the regiment mustered 320 men, 16 officers. When the roll was called at Cemetery Hill that evening, there were 75 men and 3 officers still on duty. After vicious house-to-house urban warfare, young Jacob, as far as I can tell from the information available, was one of those 75 men. In closing, as I could go on all day and rather be much more like President Lincoln than Edward Everett, a couple of quick thoughts. First, as Captain Barron said last year, the future of this hobby depends on interest. Remember, every kid that comes up to you asking questions could be our next captain or a descendant of this very unit. Remember that when people are asking you stupid questions. How you interact with them determines their impression of and ultimately the survival of the hobby. Remember that always when you are sick of dealing with them. We cannot forget today any of the men who served here. As it's my speech, selfishly, I'll throw out a couple. First, my cousin, William Alexander Artis of Company H, 4 times wounded and left for dead on this very field at age 16. He would live on to the age of 82. Also, my cousin Martin Laux of Company D, wounded and later recirculated back into the outfit. I would be remiss to forget my more distant cousins, Jacob and Joe Bittner of Company C. While Jacob would survive the great battle and live to fight in every battle the unit served and be one of the last surviving members of his company at the time of his death, his brother Joe was killed not far from this marker and is buried in the National Cemetery under an unknown marker. Additionally, a salute to Captain Joshua Duchesne and all the men of Lost Company H, which started the day with 36 men and only 2 reported for duty on the evening of July 1st. And I had the good fortune to meet one of those 2 gentlemen's descendants, 4th of July. And finally, most important tip for the captain, my 3 great-granddad, William Sleesman Rittenauer. Wounded in the left thigh in the courthouse steps in the retreat, he would spend 3 years in and out of military hospitals until the end of the war. His descendants who have researched him are in concurrence that the trauma he received here scarred him so badly that he shunned veterans organizations and never really came to terms with what happened to him here. He is buried under a family stone in Dickerson Run Union Cemetery with no mention of his military service on it and no mention of his military service even in his obituary. With apologies to great-granddad Rittenauer, we, your children, and there are 6 of us here today, know what you did here, and we're proud of it and you, even if you were never proud of yourself. Here are my favorite words of General Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain in his reminiscences of the Grand Review of the Army of the Republic, written years later. Here draws near, a moving spectacle indeed, the last of the dear old First Corps, thrice decimated at Gettysburg, in action and passion heroic, martyr-like, sublime, then merged into the 5th, proudly permitted to bear its old colors in the Crimson Campaign of 1864, fought down to a division. In the last days, the ancient spirit shining in their ranks, where its scattered regiments are absorbed into other brigades, shining still today. But where are my splendid 6 regiments of them, which made that resolute, forlorn hope charge from the crest of what they carried, Fort Hell, down past the spewing dragons of Fort Damnation, into the miry, fiery pits before Reeves Salient in the dark June 18th. 2 regiments, the 121st Pennsylvania, Colonel Warren, and 142nd Pennsylvania, Colonel Warren, alone I see in this passing pageant, worn thin hostages of the mortal. I violate the courtesies of the august occasion. I give them salutations before the face of the reviewing officer, the President himself, asking no permission, no forgiveness. The accomplishments of this outfit are eclipsed by few. The 142nd had the 9th highest combat casualties of any of the entire unit army. They had the 3rd highest of any Pennsylvania regiments. They were members of the Fighting 300 regiments. They served in every major campaign or battle of the Army of the Potomac from Fredericksburg to Appomattox. They were among the crack troops of the Army trusted with the most dangerous assignments in the final campaign at Petersburg. They were so well thought of by their peers that post-war they were invited by the survivors of the Pennsylvania Reserve to submit the documents to be fully recognized as a permanent member of the PA Reserve. Sadly, I don't think this was ever followed through. I stand here before you in solemn pride as a descendant, but also with some degree of sadness. The names and deeds of the 142nd live on through us, but if you look down the line to the left, all the way to the left flank, you will see the marker of the 121st and nobody honoring it. The men of the 121st and 142nd fought as one regiment in the closing campaigns and shared the final victory and avenged the blood spilled on this field at Five Forks, together as one, commanded by Medal of Honor winner Major West Funk of the 121st, as Colonel Warren had been wounded at Point and Plank Road. While the men of the 142nd shared bonds of family and familiarity, home and hearth with the men of the 54th, a tradition we still honor today. They shared the bonds of final victory and the hardship throughout the war with the men of the 121st. They were men whom the farmers, miners, and laborers of the 142nd would have otherwise had nothing in common. They were Philadelphians from the upper crust of society. They formed the most unlikely of friendships and bonds that lasted until they all left this earth. I need not point out that this is not unlike many of the friendships formed amongst the current vintage of the 142nd reenactors, as I could not imagine a much more diverse group of people in terms of profession, points of origins, and backgrounds. I encourage you today to stop by and share a quick glance and salute at their monument if you are so inclined. They were bound to one another through the entire war. Together they were the last of the first. So what happened to Jacob Christner? He would serve out the rest of the war, dodging death at every turn. He was lightly wounded at the Wilderness and would return to the outfit and serve out the worst of the Petersburg campaign and see the final victory at Five Forks and be present among the men of the 5th Corps to accept their surrender at Appomattox. He would return home to Garrett, a hero and a father of 3 daughters. While expecting his first and only son, he passed away at age 33 in 1875 from the same yellow jaundice he contracted at Belle Plains. Jacob Christner died in the Civil War and didn't even realize it. Not much different than our current vintage of Vietnam vets from Agent Orange. He was buried in the Ridgeview Cemetery in Garrett. His family would move to Nebraska, and he, like the war, would be mostly forgotten within a decade or two. To add insult to injury, the Ridgeview Cemetery would be abandoned and grown over completely into a crabapple thicket. The property on which the cemetery sat was purchased by Harold and Lily Gray in 1950 and was always referred to in my childhood as the Old Cemetery. Sometime in the mid-'80s, the cemetery was completely cleaned out and of the crabapple thicket that imprisoned it and restored by the Boy Scouts of America. And among the stones was a military stone simply saying Jacob Christner, Company F, 142nd Pennsylvania Volunteers, in excellent condition except for blackened by decades of tree sap, which may have actually served to preserve it. Now it is properly decorated on Decoration Day, as it should have years. Not only one of the great battlefields. We must dedicate ourselves to preservation, not only of the great battlefields, but of the final resting places of these men. Otherwise, our endeavors here are fruitless. As we walk amongst the footsteps of giants today on the sacred ground, it's just as important to not forget the giants that may be buried right in our own backyard, or more importantly, the warriors that still live amongst us, as we are losing our World War II and Korean veterans and Vietnam veterans on a daily basis. I thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Now I'd like to ask Corporal Rick Schumann from Company G to come forward.
Thank you, Rich.
I wrote it backwards.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Morning.
It was in this month of November of last year, 2018, that the 142nd Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry, Company G reenactors, experienced a profound loss in the passing of our friend and comrade in arms, Corporal Rich Schumann. In his honor, I would like to present the following verses which exemplify the quality of life that he shared with each and every one of us. Rich helped us all to remember that life is to be celebrated with a collection of happy moments worth cheering about. Today is a day of celebration as we remember the life of Rich, a life with many happy moments worthy of a second cheer. Cheer for the ways he made you feel special and important. Celebrate his love. Echo his tenacity and adventurous spirit in the way you live your life. Love every moment of life and share that with those who mean the most to you. Make this world a better place because you were here. Be brave, loyal, and caring just like he was with his closest friends and family. Radiate happiness in every way that you can. Share your joy with others so that it may spread. Advance your career, education, family, or life as a tribute to the impression that he left upon you. Be grateful toward Rich for the memories and years of friendship that he gave to you. Embark upon your own epic journey as he did so many times over the years. This is no time to mourn. He would not want us all sad and crying as we talk about his life. Let's be glad that we got to be part of his life and that he got to be part of ours. Let's be thankful for the time we had and the memories we carry. Let's be excited about our lives and how he played a hand in them. Celebration is a party. It's a major affair that can last hours, days, weeks, or months. Rich's life should be a celebration we carry on forever. Reach into your mind, your heart, and soul. Find our friend there and bring him out to rejoice alongside of you. Now that we are gathered together, let the legacy begin. Thank you.
I'd like to ask Roseanne Barr to forward the wreath.
Put you in company. Shoulder arm. Present arm.